Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits, carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. The town of Alder Creek is one of those places that the world forgets. It sits between two hills, surrounded by pine trees that never seem to lose their color, even in winter. There's only one road in and one road out, and when the fog rolls through, you can barely see the church steeple from the main street. It's the kind of town where the old ways never really died. They just linger quietly, waiting for someone to notice them again. That's where I found work, at Hollow Sun's funeral home. The sign outside still carries the original carving, worn by time. The gold letters faded to a dull gray. It's been there for over 100 years, passed down through generations of the same family. They say Old Man Hollow doesn't run it anymore. His son does. And even though it's just the two of us most nights, it feels like there are more eyes watching than there should be. My first night on the job was quieter than I expected. No grieving families, no late calls, just the smell of formaldehyde, polished wood, and a faint trace of candle wax that clung to the walls like memory. Mr. Hollow was waiting in the embalming room when I arrived, his face half lit by a single lamp. He didn't speak right away. He just studied me the way a craftsman studies a piece of wood before cutting. "You'll learn the work," he finally said. "But before that, you need to learn the rules." He handed me a folded piece of paper, creased and yellowed, with handwriting so old it looked etched instead of written. At the top, in faded ink, were the words, "Rules for the bodies that move." I let out a small laugh before I could stop myself. Bodies that move? Mr. Hollow didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on mine. "You'll understand soon enough. Read them, and remember them." The paper listed 4 rules. Never embalm alone after midnight. If a body twitches, whisper its name 3 times. Never close the lid on the coffin in room 3. If the bells ring at night, do not check who rang them. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of an old ghost story. But something in Mr. Hollow's tone told me this wasn't a joke. He didn't explain where the rules came from, or what would happen if I broke them. He just made me repeat them out loud until I could say them from memory. That night I stayed late, shadowing him as he prepared a body for viewing. The room was colder than the rest of the building, the air thick with a stillness that seemed too heavy for silence. The hum of the fluorescent lights trembled in the corners, and every small sound, the creak of a chair, the drip from a pipe, felt magnified. Mr. Hollow worked with slow precision. He moved like someone performing a sacred ritual, not just a job. His hands were steady as he arranged the tools, adjusted the lights, and spoke to the body as if it could hear him. "You treat them with respect," he said without looking up. "It's the only way they stay quiet." At first I thought he meant it metaphorically, a sign of professionalism. But then halfway through the preparation, I noticed something. The body's fingers twitched. Just once. A small, unmistakable flex, like the muscles still remembered life. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Mr. Hollow, expecting him to jump back or at least react, but he didn't even flinch. He just whispered the name written on the tag 3 times under his breath. The twitching stopped. He nodded, as if that explained everything. "They remember," he said softly. "Sometimes they need to be reminded where they are." When we were done, he turned off the lights, leaving only a single candle burning by the door. The flame bent slightly, though there was no wind. He locked the embalming room and handed me the key. "You'll be on your own tomorrow," he said. "Don't forget what you saw tonight." The walk home was short, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me out of the building. The scent of lilies clung to my clothes, faint but unmistakable. When I reached my apartment, I found a faint smudge of wax on my sleeve. the same color as the candle Mr. Hollow left burning. The next night I returned early. The place was quiet again, the air heavy with that same stillness. I walked past the viewing room, past the hall where the bells hung, and into the preparation area. The clock read 11:50. I remembered the first rule and told myself I'd leave before midnight. But time moves strangely in hollow suns. The silence stretches, folds, reshapes itself. I must have lost track because when I looked at the clock again, the hands had already passed 12. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. I was alone. A faint shuffle came from the cold room. It was soft, like fabric brushing against wood. Then the sound of something small falling, metal on tile. I stepped closer, heart beating in my throat, and found a single toe tag lying on the floor. It belonged to a man we'd embalmed the day before. His drawer was closed, the steel latch locked. But when I bent down to pick up the tag, I realized it was still warm. That's when I saw it. The faintest impression against the frosted glass of the storage drawer, like a hand pressing from the inside. My first instinct was to back away, but curiosity pinned me in place. The handprint slowly faded, melting back into the frost as if it had never been there. The drawer went still, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that listens back. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that my nerves were getting the better of me. But deep down, something in that silence knew I didn't believe it. I turned toward the hallway, intent on leaving, when I heard it again, a faint shuffle, followed by the sound of something dragging softly across the floor. The embalming room door stood half open. The candle from the night before had burned itself down to a stub. Its wax pooled and hardened on the tray. The smell of it was still there, mixed with the sterile sharpness of cleaning chemical. "Mr. Hollow?" I called out, even though I knew he wasn't there. No answer. Just a single creak from the wooden table near the center of the room. I moved closer, my shoes echoing on the tile. The light flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw someone standing near the gurney, a dark shape bent over as if examining something. When the light steadied, the figure was gone. The air turned colder, heavy enough to make my breath visible. I could smell the faintest trace of something sweet beneath the chemicals. Not lilies this time. Roses, fresh ones. I turned to leave, but then the drawer behind me gave a soft, metallic click, like a lock releasing on its own. I froze. The handle began to rattle, slow and deliberate, as if someone on the other side was testing their strength. The sound stopped. And then faintly from inside the drawer came the sound of breathing. It wasn't steady. It came in shallow, ragged pulls, like someone trying to remember how lungs were supposed to work. I whispered the name written on the toe tag 3 times, the way Mr. Hollow had done it. My voice trembled on the last repetition, and the sound of breathing stopped. The drawer went quiet again. I didn't touch it. I didn't move. I stood there until I heard the old wall clock in the hall strike 1, each chime sinking into the floorboards like a nail. When I finally stepped back, I nearly tripped over something lying at my feet. Another tag, this one blank. That was enough for the night. I locked the room, left the key where it hung, and walked straight out the front doors into the fog that had rolled over the town. When I got home, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that handprint, pale and desperate, pressing against the frost. The next morning, I arrived early again, hoping daylight would make the place feel different. It didn't. Mr. Hollow was already there, sitting in his office, sipping black coffee that smelled burnt and bitter. "You stayed late," he said without looking up. I nodded. "Something happened last night." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. "I heard movement. One of the drawers unlocked itself. I think I saw a hand." Mr. Hollow leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. "You remembered the rules?" "Yes. I said the name 3 times. "Good," he said quietly. "That's why you're still breathing." He didn't elaborate. He just sipped his coffee again, eyes half closed, as if what I said was completely normal. I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but the way he looked at me made the words die before they reached my mouth. Later that afternoon, we had a family come in to arrange a viewing for their grandfather. They spoke softly, their eyes tired but kind. The old man's body lay in the next room, prepared earlier that day. Everything appeared normal, until the youngest son approached the casket and frowned. "Why is his hand like that?" he asked. I looked closer. The man's hand rested over his heart, but his fingers were curled tightly, as if gripping something. I gently pried them open, expecting to find nothing. But inside his palm was a folded piece of paper. It was small, yellowed, and damp. The ink had bled so badly that I could only make out a few words. But one of them stood out clearly. "Awake." I hid it quickly, slipping it into my pocket before the family could notice. When they left, I brought it to Mr. Hollow. He stared at it for a long time before saying anything. "Don't keep that with you," he said finally. "Burn it. Tonight. And don't let the ashes touch your skin." That night I did as he said. I stood outside the funeral home, lit the note with a match, and watched it curl into black dust. The flames hissed faintly, like something alive being silenced. When I turned back toward the building, I noticed something strange. The window of the embalming room, the same one above the table, was fogged from the inside, and written across it, drawn with a single finger, were 3 words. "You heard me." I froze in place, my breath fogging the cold glass. The words didn't move. They didn't change, but I knew they hadn't been there before. My hand instinctively went to the key in my pocket, the one to the embalming room, and I felt a chill that ran deeper than the night air outside. The front doors of Hollow Suns creaked softly behind me, though I was sure I hadn't touched them. I turned, expecting someone to step out. Mr. Hollow, maybe, but the street was empty. Fog rolled over the cobblestones, muffling every sound except my heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the words pressed themselves into my mind. "You heard me?" The following morning, the funeral home felt different. The air inside was heavier, colder. The faint scent of wax and formaldehyde was mixed now with something else, something metallic like blood, but old and dry. Mr. Hollow didn't comment on it. He didn't need to. I could feel him watching me, silently judging whether I had understood the night's lessons. We had another body to prepare, a woman in her 60s who had died in her sleep. Normally, I would have approached the embalming with a careful detachment, but that morning, every step felt weighted. Every movement felt like it would provoke something. The woman's body lay on the gurney, peaceful, as if nothing had happened, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting. I began the usual preparations. The tools glinted under the bright fluorescent lights, sterile and cold. I had been taught to treat them as extensions of my hands, as conduits for care and control, but my hands trembled, and the tremor made me clumsy. I dropped a pair of scissors, and the metallic clang echoed across the empty room. Then I saw it. Her eyelids flickered. Just once. I froze. My heart threatened to leap out of my chest. The rules came back to me automatically. Whisper the name 3 times. I swallowed, my throat dry, and spoke it softly. The flicker stopped. I exhaled shakily, and that's when I noticed the faintest movement elsewhere. A drawer in the far corner, the one holding embalming instruments I wasn't using, shifted just slightly. Not open, not slammed, just moved. A whisper of motion that made me realize the entire room had stopped breathing with me. Mr. Hollow appeared suddenly behind me. I hadn't heard him come in. His presence was steady, a solid anchor in a sea of unease. "Do you see now?" he asked quietly. His eyes were sharp, piercing, almost predatory. "They remember." and sometimes they resist. That's why the rules exist, not to control them, but to remind them of where they belong. I nodded, though I didn't understand completely. Something inside me shivered. Later, I walked through the rows of storage drawers, checking that each body was still where it should be. Some were peaceful, some stiff and pale, others uncertain. I realized that some of the bodies seemed to turn slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to remind me that they were aware, that they were watching. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I tried to sleep at my apartment, but the images of the flickering eyelids and the moving drawer kept me awake. I couldn't tell if it was fear or fascination that held me in place. The next night, I arrived early, determined to face it. Hollow Suns was quiet, unnervingly so. I moved toward the embalming room, and the temperature dropped noticeably the moment I entered. My breath curled in front of me. Tools were lying neatly, as if waiting for me. And then I heard it. The faintest whisper. It was too soft to understand at first. Almost like a sigh. Then it became clearer, a word drawn out over the silence. "Help?" I froze. The sound seemed to come from all around me, not from any one direction. My pulse raced. I wanted to leave, but my legs refused to move. The movement began again. A drawer in the far corner rattled gently, not violently, just enough to make my ears strain. And then the same handprint appeared on the frosted glass above the preparation table, pressed firmly as if it were still alive. I whispered the name of the body I had prepared earlier, the one whose toe tag I had found on the floor, 3 times. The handprint lingered for a few moments, then faded slowly, leaving the glass clear again. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence. I wanted to believe I had imagined it. But when I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of something moving beneath one of the sheets on a gurney. Something small, shifting slightly, as if it were breathing under the fabric. My heart pounded. I swallowed and my mind raced. The rules weren't suggestions. They weren't traditions to ignore. They were instructions for survival. From that night onward, every shift became a test. Each twitch, each shuffle, every faint whisper required a response. The funeral home was no longer a place of stillness. It was a living thing, aware and patient, and I was just a part of its nightly ritual. I began to notice patterns. Certain names caused stronger reactions. Certain drawers and coffins emitted faint tremors of movement if left alone. And always that room 3 loomed in the back of my mind. The one coffin I was never allowed to close. Mr. Hollow never explained why. He only reminded me to follow the rules. And as the nights went on, I understood that the rules weren't meant to keep the dead from moving. They were meant to keep the dead from remembering everything all at once. And in a place like Hollow Suns, where the boundary between life and death is thinner than the skin of a candle flame, even the smallest mistake could awaken something that should never be disturbed. By the end of the week, I was no longer the same. I moved with caution, my eyes constantly scanning, listening for the faintest sound. The mortuary was alive in ways I couldn't explain, and I realized that nothing here was entirely dead. Not yet. The rules had become my only shield. And I knew deep down that one night, one small slip, could unravel everything. The night was still young, and I had only just begun learning the first rule. The nights at Hollow Suns became a rhythm I could never have imagined. Each evening, I arrived with a mix of dread and a strange sense of purpose. The town outside slept peacefully, unaware of the quiet stirrings within the funeral home. But inside, the air thrummed with the presence of things that should have been still. It was on a night thick with fog that I began to understand the true weight of the rules. I was alone, having arrived early to prepare for a family viewing later in the day. The building was unnaturally quiet, even for Hollow Suns. The lights flickered occasionally, as though testing my focus, teasing me into looking away from the work at hand. I approached the embalming room, key in hand, feeling the cold bite of the tile beneath my shoes. I was careful not to make a sound. I knew the moment I stepped in that the room had its own awareness. The shadows clung to the corners, forming shapes that might have been illusions but felt undeniably alive. As I moved to prepare the instruments, I heard it, a shuffle from the far side of the room, subtle but deliberate. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself of the first rule, never embalm alone after midnight. Midnight had passed by hours. Then I saw it, one of the drawers, the same one that had moved before, rattled again. A single toe tag floated across the floor as if guided by invisible fingers. I bent down and picked it up. My hand trembled, and I whispered the name 3 times, my voice barely more than a breath. The motion stopped. The room fell silent, but not empty. There was still a weight in the air, as though it pressed against my chest and tried to pull me down. I straightened slowly, sensing movement behind me. I dared not turn. The presence of someone, or something, was undeniable. Then the unmistakable sound of a coffin lid moving. Slowly. Room 3. My stomach dropped. I had never been allowed near it without Mr. Hollow. And yet, the lid was shifting lightly, the edges creaking as if the hinges themselves were straining against a weight unseen. I tried to step closer, compelled by fear and curiosity, but the floor seemed to stretch beneath me, drawing each step out longer than it should have been. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle I had brought with me. In the sudden darkness, the shadows seemed to move independently. I could hear faint breathing from beneath the sheets, soft whispers echoing around the walls. I remembered the second rule, whisper the name 3 times. But whose name? So many had stirred, so many had reached. I closed my eyes and spoke a name at random from a tag I had memorized earlier. The whispers subsided for a moment, but the lid continued to inch closed. Then a sharp, deliberate knock on the floorboards behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there. The room itself seemed to exhale, the cold air forming small clouds in front of my face. And in that moment, I realized the terrifying truth. The rules weren't about keeping the dead quiet, they were about keeping them contained. I ran to the sideboard to grab a tool, anything to block the lid. My hands shook as I gripped a steel tray. The lid moved faster now, as though sensing my intent. I threw myself against it, pressing with all my weight, but the coffin would not yield. The whispers escalated, becoming voices. Not many voices, but one voice that resonated above all. Deep, resonant, filled with hunger and frustration. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Something wanted out. Suddenly, a light appeared. Mr. Hollow stepped into the room, lantern in hand. The flickering glow revealed him as a figure carved from shadow and resolve. He didn't hesitate. He placed the dagger in my hand without a word, pressing his own palm against mine as if transferring strength. "Follow the rules," he said simply. His eyes, steady and commanding, locked onto mine. "Do exactly as I do." He began an ancient chant, the words harsh and unfamiliar, yet somehow rhythmically compelling. I echoed him, clumsily at first, then with growing certainty. The air thickened, pressing against my chest, and the lid shuddered violently. A scream erupted from within the coffin, not human, not quite dead, not quite alive. The other bodies in the room stirred, some twitching, others raising slightly as if drawn to the sound. I felt cold fingers brush against my arm, but I didn't flinch. We continued the chant together, forcing the presence back, pushing against the barrier that separated life from death. Finally, with a last shuddering groan, the lid stilled. The air cleared, and the room fell silent once more. The bodies had returned to their places, still and composed. Room 3 sat untouched, its lid closed but unthreatening. Mr. Hollow released my hand and lowered his lantern. His face was pale, drawn, but calm. "You've learned the first rule," he said. "It isn't just about surviving the night. It's about understanding your place here." One misstep, and we all pay. I nodded, exhausted beyond words. The weight of the night pressed into me, the knowledge of the rules settling deep into my bones. I understood now that every twitch, every sound, every faint movement was a test, and that the funeral home itself was alive in ways I could barely comprehend. As I left the embalming room and stepped into the hall, I glanced at room 3 one last time. The lid remained closed, but the darkness behind it seemed to breathe, waiting for the next moment of weakness. From that night onward, the rules became more than instructions. They became a lifeline, a fragile barrier between the living and the restless dead. And I realized that in this quiet town where the world outside slept, hollow suns would always demand vigilance. The bodies moved, the rules endured, and I had only just begun to learn how to survive among them. The nights at Hollow Suns grew heavier as I settled into a routine that was anything but ordinary. Each body I prepared seemed to carry its own weight of expectation, and every movement, no matter how subtle, felt like a message. I thought I had begun to understand the rules, but nothing could have prepared me for the body that blinked. It happened on a night when the fog hung thick over Alder Creek, curling around the streetlights in twisted tendrils. The town felt muted. The world outside slowed to a hush that pressed against the windows of the funeral home. Inside, the air was sharp with chemicals and the faint trace of wax from candles long burned. I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to get ahead of the evening's preparations. The body was already on the gurney, draped in white sheets. She was a woman in her late 20s, named Clara by the tag pinned delicately to her wrist. The family had left hours before, their whispers still echoing faintly in the corners, fading into the shadows. I moved carefully around her, straightening the sheet and checking the instruments that Mr. Hollow had lined meticulously along the sideboard. The room was silent, but not quiet. It was the kind of silence that hums just beneath your ears, the air vibrating with expectation. I adjusted the lamp above the gurney, the soft light falling across her face. And that's when I saw it. Her eyelids moved. Just a flicker. A subtle twitch that was almost imperceptible. I froze, unable to breathe, staring at her face. The rules flashed through my mind, vivid and urgent. Whisper the name 3 times. My mouth opened, and my voice trembled as I said it. Clara, Clara, Clara. The flicker stopped. Her eyes remained closed, her chest still, yet the weight of awareness in the room had shifted. I could feel it pressing down on me, as if the house itself leaned closer to witness my next move. I stepped back, my hands shaking, and glanced at the instruments on the sideboard. Everything was exactly where Mr. Hollow had placed it. No shift, no disturbance, except for the faint outline of movement in the shadows beyond the gurney. You see it now, don't you? Mr. Hollow's voice broke the silence, calm and unhurried. I had not heard him approach. He stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the body. I think I did, I stammered. Her eyes, she blinked. He nodded slowly as if confirming something I already feared. Not all of them sleep well. Not all of them stay still without guidance. The twitching, the blinking, it is their way of remembering. It is not your fault, nor is it the body's. It is simply the reminder that they exist still in some form between worlds. I swallowed hard, trying to comprehend what he meant. Between worlds. That's when I realized the depth of the warning in the rules. Whisper the name. Keep the lid from closing. Never question the bells. Each rule was a lifeline, a fragile thread holding the restless in place. Mr. Hollow stepped closer to the gurney, his lantern casting a soft halo over Clara's still form. He lowered his voice to a whisper, almost to himself. When they awaken even slightly, you must meet them where they are, not where you think they should be. Respect is the tether. It is all that keeps the fabric from tearing. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood. The room seemed to pulse around us, shadows stretching along the walls, twisting in ways that defied the angles of the light. I felt eyes on me, though I could not see them. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. As I prepared her for viewing, I noticed the faintest movement elsewhere. A drawer rattled, slow and deliberate. Not violently, but enough to make my breath hitch. I turned toward it, and the shape of a handprint appeared, pressing faintly against the frosted glass on the preparation table. It faded as I blinked, leaving the surface clear, yet the impression remained in my mind. I glanced at Mr. Hollow, and he gave the faintest nod, almost imperceptible. He did not speak, but I understood. The body that blinked was not an anomaly. It was a reminder, a test, and a signal of something far older than the walls that held us. That night, the whispers began, soft, almost melodic, floating on the edge of hearing. Not words I could understand, but sounds that tugged at my memory, at my sense of self. Clara's body remained still, eyes closed, yet I could feel the pulse of awareness beneath her skin, a rhythm that belonged neither fully to the living or the dead. I moved around the room, careful to follow the motions Mr. Hollow had taught me. Each instrument I touched was deliberate, each step measured. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap. A footstep, perhaps, though no one was there. The air thickened, pressing in around me, and I realized with a chill that I was no longer alone. The blinking had not been random. It was a message, an invitation, a warning. The boundaries in the hollow suns were thinner than I had imagined, and each body held its own memory, its own will. Clara had remembered enough to blink, enough to remind me that the rules were not suggestions. I whispered her name 3 times again, louder this time, and the room seemed to settle slightly. The shadows receded, but the weight remained. I knew the night was far from over. There would be more movements, more whispers, and more lessons to be learned in the company of the restless. When I finally left the embalming room, the fog outside felt thicker, the town quieter, as though it had sensed what had happened within those walls. I walked through the empty streets, every step echoing in the mist. The world outside was oblivious, but inside Hollow Suns, life and death were entwined in ways I could barely comprehend. That night I slept fitfully, dreaming of blinking eyes and whispered names. And when I awoke, I knew the rules were more than instructions. They were survival. The dead were not silent, and they were not still. They waited, patient, aware. And the body that blinked had shown me just how fragile the line between waking and remembering truly was. The days that followed blurred into one another. Each shift at Hollow Suns carried a weight I had not known existed, a tension that was as constant as the smell of embalming fluid and old wax. Clara's body remained on the gurney still for most of the day, yet I could feel her awareness pressing outward, testing the boundaries I had been told to respect. By the 3rd night, I had begun to notice subtle patterns. Certain movements, faint twitches, or the soft flicker of an eyelid always coincided with sounds in the room. A drawer would shift, a floorboard would creak, or the air would grow inexplicably cold. It was never violent, never overtly threatening, but it was insistent, a reminder that the house and the bodies within it were alive in ways I could not see. That night I arrived early. The fog outside was dense, rolling in from the hills like waves frozen in time. The streetlights struggled to pierce it, casting weak, wavering pools of yellow across the cobblestones. Inside, the funeral home felt as if it had been waiting for me. The air was heavier, colder than the morning, with a metallic tang lurking beneath the familiar scents. I approached Clara's gurney cautiously. Her hands were folded across her chest, the sheet smooth and unbroken. I reached for the instruments Mr. Hollow had prepared and arranged them exactly as instructed, careful not to disrupt the fragile order of the room. And then I saw it again, just a flicker, a subtle twitch of an eyelid. My heart stuttered. My hands froze in midair. The world seemed to tilt, and the shadows on the walls stretched toward her as though drawn by the pull of awareness. I whispered her name once. Nothing. Twice. The twitch intensified. On the third repetition, her eyes opened just barely, revealing irises too dark to distinguish clearly in the dim light. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding, my mind screaming that I had broken the rules. Mr. Hollow stepped into the room behind me, his presence calm and commanding. He did not scold, did not panic. He simply said, "You have startled her, that is all. Now, guide her back." Guide her back. His words echoed in my mind. Though I did not yet understand them fully, I leaned closer, careful not to loom over her. My voice trembled as I whispered her name again. Slower this time, softer, almost a lullaby. The movement slowed, her eyelids fluttered, and then she closed them completely. The room exhaled. The shadows receded slightly, and the air grew warmer. But the awareness lingered, pressing against me in a way that made my skin crawl. Clara was still, but she was not asleep. I could feel it in the silence around me, the faint hum of life beneath her pale skin. Later, I attempted to clean the gurney, to restore order to the instruments in the workspace. Every brush of my hand against metal or cloth seemed magnified, every step along the tile echoing as though the room itself were listening. And it was. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw nothing. That's when I noticed the small movement along the edge of the sheet. A fingertip, curling just slightly. My breath hitched. I remembered the third rule, never close the lid on room 3. But the warning extended beyond that single coffin. It was about restraint, patience, understanding that the dead had memory, that they could feel and remember in ways that transcended life and death. I whispered her name 3 more times, deliberate, careful, until her hand relaxed. The sheet fell naturally over her chest once more, and the room seemed to settle. The tension lingered, but the immediate urgency passed. Mr. Hollow appeared then, silent as a shadow, his eyes scanning the room. Some awakenings are simple, others are more insistent. You must learn to read the difference. Clara will test you more in time. It is not malevolence. She is simply aware. Aware. The word settled in my mind like a stone in water, sending ripples I could not ignore. The dead, I realized, were not passive vessels. They were participants in a world that ran parallel to ours, a place where time and memory intertwined, and where the rules were the only thing that prevented them from stepping across the threshold completely. The night dragged on. I continued my duties with deliberate care, my senses heightened to every sound and shadow. The room itself seemed alive, the air pulsing, the floorboards whispering beneath my weight. At one point, a drawer rattled gently, a soft metallic clang, but when I turned, it was empty. Still, I felt the pressure of her awareness, a reminder that even when still, she was listening. By the time I left the embalming room, the fog outside had thickened further, muffling every sound from the street. The town slept, oblivious to the things that stirred in hollow suns. I walked through the hall, every step measured, every shadow noted. Clara's gaze, though closed, seemed to follow me in ways I could not rationalize. That night, sleep came only in short bursts. Every blink, every twitch, every whisper I imagined kept me awake. The dead were not gone. They were patient. They remembered. And Clara had shown me that even the smallest stirrings could carry weight far beyond my understanding. By morning, I knew with certainty that Hollow Suns was a place of vigilance, a living, breathing organism that required attention and respect. And the body that blinked had been my first true lesson in awareness, patience, and the fragile boundary between life and the restless. The rules were no longer instructions. They were survival. And I had only just begun to understand what it meant to follow them faithfully. That night, the air in Hollow Suns was impossibly still, yet it carried a weight that pressed against my chest with every step. Clara's body lay under the same white sheet, seemingly peaceful, yet I knew better. The flicker of her eyelids during the day had left a mark on my mind that refused to fade. I had learned to approach each body with caution, but she was different. She was aware. As I entered the embalming room, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath formed thick clouds, and the lantern I carried trembled in my hand. Shadows pooled in the corners, moving slightly as if the darkness itself were sentient. I could hear faint whispers, too low to understand, yet filled with unmistakable intent. The sound made the hairs on my neck rise. I approached Clara's gurney slowly. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to step back. But I knew the rules. Whisper the name 3 times. Be deliberate. Respect. I spoke softly, my voice trembling. Clara, Clara, Clara. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyelids fluttered, just enough to reveal a glint in the depths of her eyes. Not fully open, but a spark of life that sent a chill racing down my spine. I froze, gripping the sides of the gurney for balance. The shadows deepened, almost curling around her like smoke. You see now? Mr. Hollow's voice whispered from the doorway. I had not heard him enter. His eyes were steady, trained, and cold with understanding. She remembers, and in remembering she tests. You must meet her there. Do not falter. I swallowed hard and my throat dry and tried to steady my hands. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for her hand. It was cool, lifeless in temperature. But when I brushed against her palm, a subtle pressure pushed back. Not forceful, but insistent, like a heartbeat I could not measure. Whisper the name again, 3 times. I repeated it, softer this time, almost a lullaby. Clara's eyes twitched more visibly, and I felt an inexplicable tug, as if the air itself were leaning toward her. The room seemed to pulse with every breath, and I realized with a shiver that this was not just about her. The house itself responded to her awareness. Every shadow, every object, even the walls themselves, seemed attuned to the rhythm of the living and the not quite dead. A drawer rattled. Not violently, but enough to make my stomach knot. The tools inside clinked together in quiet protest. I glanced at Mr. Hollow. He did not flinch. He only gave the faintest nod, urging me to continue. Clara's eyelids twitched again. I spoke her name once more. And then, slowly, her hand moved. A single finger lifted from her palm, hovering slightly above the sheet. My heart hammered so loud I was sure it would echo through the house. I whispered her name a final time. Her hand relaxed and lying flat once more, as if she had tested me and found me sufficient. The room exhaled, though I knew it was only my imagination. The shadows recoiled slightly, and the temperature seemed to rise by a fraction, though the chill remained in every corner. Mr. Hollow stepped forward, placing a hand on the gurney, his fingers hovering above hers without touching. Not all awakenings are as simple as this, he said quietly. Some will reach farther, remember deeper. Some will test your resolve. You must be vigilant. This is the line between order and chaos. I nodded, though I understood only in part. I had learned that the dead were not inert. They remembered. They reacted. They waited. And Clara had shown me the fragile nature of the barrier we maintained with rules and ritual. Later, as I prepared the rest of the instruments and cleaned the tables, I noticed movement elsewhere. A shadow shifted near the far corner where old urns and records were stored. The air felt heavier there, oppressive, and I could almost hear whispering, rising and falling in an eerie cadence. Not Clara, not exactly, but a presence tied to her, or perhaps one she had awakened with her brief stirrings. I left the embalming room only when my legs threatened to give out. The fog outside had thickened, wrapping the town in silence. The streets were empty, the world oblivious to the delicate tension that existed just beyond their awareness. Inside, Hollow Sons waited, patient, observant, alive. That night, sleep came only fitfully. I dreamt of blinking eyes, soft whispers, and fingers reaching from beneath sheets. I dreamt of movement that was deliberate, purposeful, and yet silent. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel her awareness, hovering at the edge of consciousness, reminding me that the rules were not arbitrary. They were survival. By morning, I understood something new. Clara was not a threat. She was a teacher. Every twitch, every flicker, every movement was a lesson in respect, caution, and the fragile boundary that separated the living from the restless. The body that blinked had revealed the truth of Hollow Sun. The dead were aware, patient, and infinitely observant. And I, if I hoped to survive the nights to come, had to learn to follow the rules flawlessly. Every name whispered, every drawer watched, every lid left open or closed mattered. And even then, I knew that understanding one body was only the beginning. There were others, far older, far more insistent. And Clara had just shown me how easily the veil between life and the not-quite-dead could tremble at the slightest disturbance. The rules had become my lifeline, and the funeral home had become a place of constant vigilance. Each night was no longer simply a shift. It was a test, and I was only beginning to understand the stakes. The house waited, patient and observant. Clara waited, aware and watchful. And I realized that the boundary I had once taken for granted was thinner than I had ever imagined. The dead moved, and they remembered. The funeral home had grown quieter in the days following Clara's awakening, though the silence was deceptive. Hollow Suns was never truly still. It waited, patient and observing, the air heavy with the presence of those who remembered, those who lingered just beyond the edge of perception. I had learned to move cautiously, to follow the rules, to respect the fragile line between life and the restless dead. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the whispers. It began subtly at first, a faint rustle of sound in the hallways. Not voices I could understand, but soft intonations that brushed against my mind, curling through the edges of thought like smoke through cracks. At first, I assumed it was the wind or perhaps the old building settling. But Hollow Suns had no drafts, and the wooden floorboards were tight and stubborn underfoot. The whispers had intention. They were alive. I had heard vague warnings from Mr. Hollow about Room 3, the one coffin I was never to close, the chamber of secrets in the farthest corner of the funeral home. Until now, I had been careful to avoid it, to respect the boundary imposed by the rules. But the whispers drew me closer, a thread of curiosity that I could not ignore. They were soft, insistent, urging, coaxing, brushing against the edges of memory and fear. That night I arrived early, carrying nothing but a lantern and the weight of vigilance. The fog outside clung to the cobblestones, suffocating and thick, swallowing the light of the street lamps. Inside, the air smelled of wax and chemicals, familiar yet tainted by an undercurrent I could not name. Every step I took toward the far corner of the building made the shadows bend slightly, elongating and twisting in subtle ways that seemed unnatural. The whispers grew stronger as I approached. Soft syllables like words I almost recognized but could not fully grasp. They were rhythmic, hypnotic in their cadence, and the closer I drew, the more the room seemed to breathe. I realized with a shiver that the whispers were not coming from anywhere in particular. They came from everywhere. They came from the walls, the floors, the coffins, from the bodies themselves. Room 3 was just ahead. Its door was plain, unassuming, but something about it radiated unease. I had walked past it countless times, never daring to glance inside, yet tonight the whispers emanated from it like a heartbeat. My hand hovered above the doorknob, and I felt the familiar pressure of awareness pressing against me, patient and expectant. I reminded myself of the rules. Never close the lid on Room 3. Never question the bells. Whisper the names 3 times when movement occurs. Each instruction carried more weight than I had understood when I first read them. I had followed them carefully, yet the house seemed to push me forward now, daring me to step closer, to see what lay beyond the threshold. The door creaked faintly as I pushed it open. The light from my lantern fell across the room in soft, trembling pools. The space inside was small, cramped, lined with shelves of old records and boxes containing funeral supplies, long forgotten. But at the center, under a single flickering lamp, sat a coffin. Its wood was dark, polished to a dull gleam, and the lid was slightly ajar. A cold breeze swept from within the coffin, brushing against my face, carrying a scent I could not place. Not decay, not flowers, but something old, something alive. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent now, threading around my thoughts, tugging at my attention. I could not understand them, but I felt their intent. They wanted recognition. They wanted me to see, to hear, to acknowledge what had been hidden. I stepped closer, lantern held high. The floor beneath me creaked under the weight of tension. The shadows seemed to thicken around the coffin, pooling at the edges of the room, pressing against the walls as if they too were listening. I caught movement beneath the sheet covering the coffin. Not large, not violent, but deliberate. A finger curling slightly, then releasing. I swallowed hard. I whispered the rule to myself over and over as if saying it aloud could ground me in reality. And then I whispered a name from the ledger I had memorized, a name I knew belonged to one of the older bodies stored in the back. The movement paused. The whispers still, though the pressure of presence did not lessen. I realized then that the whispers were not random. They were tied to consciousness, memory, awareness. Each sound, each flicker of motion, each pulse of breathless air was a signal, a request. And room 3, I understood, was a locus, a gathering point, a place where the boundary between life and the restless was thinnest. The coffin lid shifted slowly, and I instinctively stepped back. The whispers coalesced into something almost intelligible, a low hum of murmured syllables that brushed against my mind. I could feel eyes on me, though no one was visible. The hair on my arms stood on end. My chest tightened. Mr. Hollow's voice echoed softly from somewhere behind me. You are ready to listen now. Not with your ears, but with your awareness. This room speaks to those who heed it. I turned, half expecting to see him, but he was gone. The whispers grew louder, pressing, insistent. I felt my hand tremble as I reached toward the lid. Just a touch, to steady it, to acknowledge it, but not to close it. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a shiver ran through the floor, through the air, and through me. The whispers surged into a coherent hum, almost like a chorus. Words I could not comprehend, yet understood in feeling. Patience, attention, respect, awareness. The air was alive with memory, with history, with life, and unlife entwined. I realized then that the whispers were a test, a measure of vigilance, not punishment, not threat, but a gauging of intent and understanding. The room would reveal nothing to the unworthy, nothing to the careless, and Clara, the body that had blinked, had been merely the beginning of this lesson. The coffin lid quivered. Not enough to open, not enough to fall, but enough to remind me that the veil was thin, that room 3 waited, patient and watchful for the unwary, the unprepared, or the curious who dared to push boundaries too far. The whispers pressed closer, wrapping around my thoughts, threading through my memory. I felt my pulse sync with the rhythm of the room, the cadence of awareness it demanded. Every sound mattered. Every shadow mattered. Every twitch mattered. I understood then why the rules existed, why Mr. Hollow never explained them fully, and why room 3 was forbidden. It was not a coffin. It was a threshold, a focal point for memory, for presence, for the delicate tether that kept the restless contained. And tonight, it was teaching me what it meant to listen. I left the room slowly, my lantern casting tremulous light across the walls. The whispers receded but did not vanish. They lingered, threads of sound that followed me through the hallways, soft and insistent. The funeral home was alive, patient, and aware. And I, now more than ever, understood that my survival depended not just on rules, but on listening, on perceiving, and on respecting the consciousness of the dead. As I stepped out into the foggy night, I realized that Room 3 had awakened something in me. A vigilance I had never known, a connection I could not yet articulate, and an understanding that the dead were not silent. They spoke softly, persistently, and those who listened closely might just survive to see another dawn. The following nights blurred into a haze of shadows and whispers. Hollow suns had transformed in ways I could barely describe. The building no longer felt like a space of stillness, but a living entity, attentive, patient, and aware. Room 3 had left its mark on me, and I could sense it even when I avoided the far corner. Every sound, every tremor of the floorboards carried weight. Every faint creak in the walls felt like communication. One night I arrived to find the whispers louder than usual, threading through the hallways in an almost rhythmic pattern, curling around corners, under doors, and through cracks in the wood. They were soft but insistent, pressing against my consciousness, pulling me toward the far corner where Room 3 waited. I tried to resist, reminding myself of the rules, but a part of me, curious, foolish, and alive, was drawn toward them. The lantern in my hand cast trembling light along the walls, stretching shadows into shapes that seemed to sway in time with the whispers. Each step toward Room 3 made the air thicker, colder, heavier. I felt the weight of countless presences pressing down from every direction, patient but watchful. It was as if the funeral home itself were alive, listening to my heartbeat, judging my intent. As I neared the forbidden coffin, the whispers coalesced into something almost intelligible. A phrase, a word, a syllable, something I could not quite comprehend, but the meaning was unmistakable. Attention, acknowledgement, respect. The air vibrated with expectation, as though the very molecules of the room were attuned to the careful rhythm of my movements. The coffin lid shifted slightly. Not enough to open, not enough to fall, but just enough to make me flinch. My lantern wavered in my grip, casting light across the polished wood. A faint fog seemed to seep from the edges of the lid, curling upward in thin, ghostly tendrils that dissolved into the shadows. I swallowed hard and reminded myself of the rules. Whisper the name 3 times. Respect. Do not falter. I whispered the name of an older body stored elsewhere in the room. The movement paused for a heartbeat, then continued, subtle but deliberate. I could feel it, the awareness beneath the sheet, coiling and uncoiling like a quiet pulse. The whispers surged, brushing against my mind in a soft chorus, almost melodic, almost pleading. I realized then that the whispers were not random. They were signals, calls for recognition, tests of vigilance. Each sound, each twitch, each flicker of movement was a reminder that the dead were not inert, that the rules were not arbitrary, and that Room 3 was a focal point of awareness, memory, and latent will. A sudden cold brush against my arm made me jump. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Shadows twisted along the walls, darker than they had been moments before, stretching toward the coffin as if drawn by its presence. My pulse hammered in my ears. I whispered the name again, 3 times, slower this time, deliberate, careful. The movement slowed, then stopped. The whispers softened but did not vanish, lingering like a fading hum at the edge of perception. I exhaled, shaking, and stepped closer to the coffin. A fingertip lifted from beneath the sheet, curling just slightly. The movement was deliberate, a test, a probe. My hand hovered above the lid, and I realized with a chill that Room 3 had its own intelligence, its own awareness. It watched, measured, and waited. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, insistent, threading through the room like a tide rising against a shore. The coffin lid shifted again, this time more forcefully, a subtle heave that made the air tremble. My lantern wavered. I felt my knees weaken, but I did not step back. I whispered the name once more, steadily, deliberately, and felt a quiet alignment, a settling of the room. Mr. Hollow appeared silently behind me, his presence calm, commanding, unwavering. "You are learning," he said softly. "The room tests those who enter. Some falter, some fail, but you are listening. That is the first step." I nodded, still trembling. The whispers continued, soft, insistent, reminding me that awareness was a constant vigilance, not a one-time test. Room 3 was alive in ways I had not imagined, a nexus of memory and will, a place where the veil between life and the restless was thinnest. As I left the room, the whispers receded slightly, but they lingered in my mind, threading through my thoughts like a persistent wind. The funeral home exhaled quietly around me, patient, observant, alive. Every step I took along the fog-draped streets outside was heavy with understanding. I knew now that Hollow Suns was not a building of stillness, but a living organism of memory, awareness, and the delicate balance between the living and the restless dead. I slept fitfully that night, the whispers threading through my dreams, urging me to listen, to observe, to respect. And when I awoke, I understood something deeper. Room 3 was a teacher, a sentinel, a warning. The dead did not simply rest. They watched. They remembered. And those who failed to recognize their presence would pay a price. The rules were no longer abstract guidelines. They were a lifeline. Every whisper, every flicker of movement, every subtle shift of air or shadow mattered. And I knew that my lessons in the whispering room were only just beginning. The nights at Hollow Suns became a delicate dance of vigilance and awareness. Each step through the funeral home felt heavier than the last, weighted with knowledge that the building itself had a consciousness, and that Room 3 pulsed at its very heart. The whispers had not left me. They trailed through the hallways, wrapping around corners, threading under doors, always present, always insistent. That night I arrived earlier than usual. The fog outside clung thick to the cobblestones, muffling every distant sound. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of embalming fluid, wax, and something older than the building itself. It lingered like a memory pressed into the walls, a reminder that this place had seen generations of the restless. I approached Room 3 cautiously, lantern in hand. The shadows in the hall seemed to lengthen, curling toward the door, and the whispers pulsed softly through the silence. I stopped just outside, my heart hammering. The rules repeated themselves in my mind like a mantra. Never close the lid. Never ignore the whispers. Whisper the names when movement occurs. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open. Light spilled across the room, revealing the familiar clutter of old records and funeral supplies. Yet at the center, the coffin waited. The lid had shifted, opened just enough to reveal a shadowed interior. I felt the cold sweep from within, brushing against my face, carrying the faint, indescribable scent of memory and longing. The whispers coalesced around me, soft but urgent. I could feel their rhythm, their cadence, urging recognition, demanding attention. I whispered a name from the ledger 3 times, carefully, deliberately. The lid shifted again, and I felt the presence within. A subtle, deliberate motion, a finger curling slightly, a hand flexing beneath the sheet. The room pulsed with awareness, and I realized that Room 3 was testing me, measuring my respect, my patience, my ability to follow the rules. The shadows along the walls thickened and twisted. moving with intent, reacting to every flicker of the lantern's light. I could hear breathing, or something like it, emanating from the coffin. A soft, low hum intertwined with the whispers, vibrating in the air, resonating in my chest. It was not human, but it was alive. I took a cautious step closer. My hand hovered above the lid, trembling as the cold pressed in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, threading around my thoughts, almost melodic, almost pleading. I realized then that the coffin held not just a body, but consciousness, memory, awareness. The dead inside were not inert. They were observing, waiting, testing. Suddenly the coffin shuddered slightly, a subtle but deliberate motion that sent a jolt through the room. I froze, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. The whispers surged, pressing into my mind with insistent rhythm. I whispered the name again, 3 times, louder this time, steadying myself against the pull of the presence. A single hand emerged, lifting from beneath the sheet, not fully but enough to make my breath catch. The fingers flexed, curling slowly, deliberately, as if reaching not for me, but for acknowledgement. I realized with a shiver that Room 3 did not desire harm. It desired recognition, vigilance, respect. Mr. Hollow's voice cut through the thick air, calm and commanding. Do not fear what awakens here. Listen, observe, respect. The dead do not act out of malice. They remember, they test, and they wait for those who will honor the balance. I nodded, still shaking and focused on the coffin. The hand receded slowly beneath the sheet, and the lid settled, though not completely closed. The whispers softened but remained, an undercurrent threading through the air, insistent and patient. I understood now that Room 3 was a nexus, a place where the boundary between life and the restless was thinnest, a place where the rules mattered most. Hours passed as I remained in the room, careful to follow every instinct, every lesson. Each movement, each whispered name, each shadow observed had weight. I could feel the presence pulsing beneath the lid, patient and aware, as if it measured my resolve and my vigilance. Finally, I stepped back, a lantern in hand, my body exhausted but alert. The coffin remained still, the lid slightly ajar, the hand beneath waiting in quiet vigilance. The whispers receded into soft hums, threading through the room like faint echoes, but their presence lingered, a reminder of the fragile balance maintained by rules, respect, and awareness. I left Room 3 slowly, careful not to disturb anything, careful not to forget the lesson I had been taught. The fog outside pressed against the windows, the streets empty, the town unaware of the tension that pulsed within hollow suns. Every step through the hallways was measured, deliberate, and attentive. The whispers followed me, soft and insistent, threading through my mind, a constant reminder of what awaited within that room. Sleep that night was restless. Every shadow, every twitch of the wind, every faint sound seemed to echo the whispers, threading through my consciousness like silk. I knew now that Room 3 was not just a place of rules, but a teacher, a sentinel, a reminder of the balance that held the restless in place. The coffin, the lid, the presence within. All were lessons, tests, and warnings. By morning, I understood that Hollow Suns was alive in ways I could never have anticipated. The whispers, the flickers, the movement. They were not threats. They were guidance, a measure of my awareness, a gauge of my respect. And Room 3, patient and watchful, waited for the next night, the next lesson, the next test. The funeral home had become a place of vigilance, a living organism sustained by rules, respect, and observation. And I had only just begun to learn what it truly meant to listen. The air in Hollow Suns had grown heavier over the past weeks, thick with the presence of memories and awareness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Every step I took echoed differently now, softer, slower, as though the building had learned to listen to my movements and measured each one carefully. The whispers from room 3 persisted, a low, persistent hum at the edge of consciousness, reminding me that vigilance was never optional. That night, the fog outside pressed closer to the windows, rolling over the cobblestones in slow, suffocating waves. Lantern in hand, I entered the funeral home with a sense of both dread and familiarity. I had become attuned to its rhythms, the quiet creaks of the floorboards, the faint hiss of air through the old ventilation, the subtle shifts in shadows that hinted at unseen presences. Yet there was something different tonight, a weight that seemed to pulse beneath the floor, beneath the walls, beneath the very air. Room 3 waited at the end of the hallway. The door, plain and unassuming, seemed to exude an energy I could feel in my chest. My hand hovered over the knob, steadying my breath, recalling the rules. Never close the lid. Whisper the names when movement occurs, and above all, respect the presence within. That coffin had been forbidden for a reason, a rule etched into the very fabric of the house, carried through generations of Hollow Sun's keepers. I opened the door slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The light from my lantern trembled across the room, illuminating the familiar clutter of records and supplies, but all attention was drawn to the coffin at the center. Its lid remained slightly ajar, and I could feel the subtle pressure of awareness emanating from within. The air was colder here than anywhere else in the funeral home, carrying a scent I could not name, a mixture of wax, old wood, and something older, something alive. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, insistent, threading through the air in undulating patterns. They were not words I could understand, but their meaning was unmistakable. Observe, respect, remember. I whispered a name from the ledger 3 times, careful and deliberate, and the movement beneath the sheet paused, subtle but deliberate. A finger flexed, curling slightly, and I felt the pull of something patient, something ancient, testing my awareness. I had never encountered a presence quite like this. Clara had blinked, but she was young, unpracticed in her memory and her awareness. This coffin held something older, something that had lingered longer, something that knew rules but did not fear them. The hand beneath the sheet flexed again, slower this time, deliberate, a reminder of consciousness that existed beyond the boundaries of life. A soft, low thrum filled the room, vibrating in my chest. It was as though the coffin itself was breathing, aware of my presence, assessing my actions. Shadows along the walls deepened, curling toward the coffin, pressing closer as if to reinforce the weight of its vigilance. The air around me pulsed, thickening, vibrating in rhythm with the whispers. I realized then why the rule existed. The lid must never be closed. Not for my convenience, not for neatness, not for fear of accidents. Closing that lid would be an act of violation, a disruption of delicate balance, a breach of trust, with a presence that remembered far beyond my understanding. Each movement, each whisper, each shadow mattered here. Awareness was fragile, and respect was its tether. I took a cautious step closer. My lantern trembled slightly in my hand, and the shadows stretched, twisting in response. The whispers rose into a chorus, not loud but insistent, threading into my consciousness. I could feel my pulse sync with the rhythm, my breathing adjusting to the cadence of awareness that emanated from the coffin. A finger lifted fully, curling toward the air, deliberate and measured. I swallowed hard, and my hands slick with sweat, and whispered the name again 3 times. The movement paused, then retreated beneath the sheet. But the pressure of presence remained. The coffin was awake. It was aware. It was measuring me. The room seemed to contract, the walls leaning closer as if to focus on the interaction between me and the coffin. The air vibrated with tension, every particle charged with memory and will. I understood with a shiver that this was not just a test of attention, but of respect, of restraint. a patience. The slightest misstep could provoke unrest, could disrupt the balance that the funeral home had maintained for generations. I remained there for hours, moving slowly, deliberately, whispering names, observing the faintest shifts in shadows and movement. The lid quivered once, then settled, never fully closing, and I understood that the coffin itself enforced the rule. It allowed only what was necessary, responding to intent, to mindfulness, to awareness. By the time I finally stepped away, exhausted and drained, the whispers had softened to a low, insistent hum. The coffin remained patient, watchful, a sentinel of memory and awareness. The air in the room lingered heavy with presence, the shadows curling softly around the edges, waiting. I left room 3 slowly, careful not to disturb anything, careful to remember the lesson it had imparted. Hollow suns exhaled quietly around me, patient, observant, alive. The fog outside pressed against the windows, the streets empty, the town unaware of the delicate tension that pulsed within those walls. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every shadow in my room seemed to stretch toward me. Every faint sound from the street carried the weight of whispers and awareness. I realized that Hollow Suns was not simply a funeral home. It was a living organism sustained by rules, by vigilance, by the constant awareness of the restless dead. The coffin that must never be closed had shown me the fragility of balance, the necessity of respect, and the true weight of presence. It was patient, watchful, and infinitely aware. And I, if I hoped to survive the nights to come, had to do more than follow the rules. I had to understand them, embody them, and recognize that every action mattered. The night stretched on, the whispers threading through my consciousness, a reminder that vigilance was eternal, and that the presence within the coffin waited, patient and observant, for those who dared to listen. The nights at Hollow Suns had grown longer, heavier, each step through its halls more deliberate than the last. The whispers from room 3 followed me even when I avoided the far corner, threading along the walls and under doors, curling through the floorboards, carrying the faint rhythm of memory and intent. The coffin had become more than an object. It was a presence, patient, observant, infinitely aware. That night I arrived early, the fog pressing like a living thing against the windows. My lantern trembled slightly in my hand, its light casting long, quivering shadows across the hall. Every creak of the floorboard, every subtle shift of air seemed magnified, each one a potential signal of awareness. I walked slowly, intentionally, toward room 3, reminding myself of the rules. Never close the lid. Whisper the names when movement occurs. Respect. The door to room 3 was plain, unremarkable, yet it radiated a quiet tension. My hand hovered over the knob. I felt the subtle pull of attention pressing against me, an awareness that extended beyond the threshold, reaching for acknowledgement. I opened the door, lantern held high, and the familiar scent of wax and old wood greeted me, mixed now with the faintest trace of something unplaceably ancient, alive, patient. The coffin sat at the center of the room, the lid slightly ajar. A finger flexed beneath the sheet as I approached, deliberate and measured. The air vibrated faintly with whispers, threading through my mind in patterns I could not decipher, but felt with perfect clarity. The presence within the coffin was aware of me, measuring my intent, my vigilance, my respect for the delicate balance it maintained. I whispered a name from the ledger, careful to follow the rhythm of the rule. 3 repetitions, deliberate, mindful. The finger beneath the sheet lifted slightly in acknowledgement, then retreated. A subtle thrum filled the air, vibrating in my chest, a pulse that synchronized with my heartbeat. The coffin was alive in its awareness, responding to my actions, gauging my patience. Suddenly, the lid shifted more forcefully, a movement that caused the lantern to tremble in my hand. Shadows along the walls twisted in response, curling toward the coffin as though drawn to its awareness. The whispers surged, rising in insistence, threading into my thoughts, soft but urgent. I realized with a shiver that this was more than observation. It was a test. My every action, every breath, every movement carried weight. I stepped closer, careful, deliberate, mindful of every detail. My hand hovered just above the lid, steadying it, acknowledging the presence without violating the rule. The whispers coalesced into a rhythmic cadence, pressing against my consciousness, teaching, guiding, warning. A low hum resonated beneath the floor, intertwining with the whispers, vibrating in perfect unison with the awareness of the coffin. The coffin lid trembled again. I could see the outline of a hand beneath the sheet, moving deliberately, flexing, curling. It was not threatening. It was insisting, observing, waiting. The presence demanded recognition, vigilance, and respect. I whispered the name once more, slowly, deliberately, and felt the subtle alignment of energy in the room. The hand receded slightly, the lid settled, but not fully. Mr. Hollow appeared silently behind me, his presence calm and commanding. "Do not fear the awareness," he said softly. "It is not malevolent. It measures. It remembers. It waits for those who will honor its presence." I nodded, my pulse hammering, my body tense. I understood now that the coffin's rule, the one that forbade closing the lid, was not about safety or tradition. It was about balance. Closing the lid would have been an act of disruption, a breach of a fragile agreement, with a consciousness far older than my own. Every whisper, every flicker, every pulse of movement mattered. The air thickened. The coffin shifted again, slowly, deliberately. Shadows along the walls pooled more densely, pressing closer to the center. I realized then that the coffin's awareness extended beyond itself, influencing the room, bending the air, the light, the perception around it. It was a nexus of vigilance, memory, and latent will. Hours passed as I maintained my presence, whispering names, observing movement, following the rhythm of the room. The lid quivered occasionally, responding to my awareness, teaching me restraint and respect. The whispers threaded through the walls, threading into my mind, reminding me that every detail mattered. The coffin was alive in a way that defied understanding, yet demanded acknowledgement. By the time I stepped back, exhausted and alert, I understood fully why the rules existed. They were not arbitrary, and they were lifelines. The coffin that must never be closed was a sentinel, patient and watchful, a measure of vigilance and respect. Its presence demanded understanding, attention, and care. I left room 3 slowly, careful not to disturb anything, carrying the weight of awareness and respect like a second skin. The whispers receded slightly but remained at the edges of consciousness, a reminder that the coffin waited, patient, observant, and infinitely aware. Hollow Suns was alive, and I had only begun to learn what it meant to honor its presence. The night deepened, and Hollow Suns seemed to breathe around me, alive with whispers and subtle movement. Room 3 pulsed with presence, its awareness stretching into the corners, threading through the walls, curling under doors, and pressing against my consciousness. Every step I took toward the coffin carried weight. Every exhalation, every heartbeat, every flicker of thought was measured and observed. I stepped closer to the lid, careful, deliberate, aware. The shadows around me thickened, curling like smoke, drawn to the coffin's presence, pooling at its edges as if to reinforce the boundary between life and the restless. The hand beneath the sheet moved deliberately, flexing and curling, insistent yet measured, like a pulse of memory made flesh. I whispered a name 3 times, slow, deliberate, mindful. The air vibrated softly in response, the low hum threading through the floorboards, the walls threading through me. Then the coffin shifted more forcefully. A vibration ran through the room, and the shadows surged toward it, pressing the edges of the walls closer, leaning as though the building itself were holding its breath. The presence within the coffin was no longer subtle. It demanded acknowledgement. I could feel it watching, measuring, weighing my every action. Every careful movement was observed, every whisper noted, every step recorded in the silent ledger of awareness that the coffin maintained. A low hum grew into a chorus of whispers, threading around me like wind through reeds. It was insistent now, nearly intelligible in its cadence. Attention, respect, vigilance, awareness. The words did not form in language I could speak, yet their meaning was undeniable. Room 3 was alive with intent, and I was its focus. I could not falter. I could not fail. I placed my hand gently on the edge of the coffin, careful not to close the lid. The movement caused a ripple through the air, a subtle vibration, as though the coffin itself were breathing, alive in a rhythm I could not yet comprehend. Shadows writhed slightly in response, the edges of the room seeming to bend toward the coffin's consciousness. My pulse accelerated, but I kept my breath steady, whispering another name 3 times, deliberate, mindful, precise. The hand beneath the sheet lifted again, curling upward, deliberate, insistent. It was a greeting, a test, a measurement of my awareness. I could feel the pressure of presence pressing against my chest, threading through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like smoke. This was no mere body. This was a consciousness older than I could imagine, patient, observant, and infinitely aware. Suddenly, the lid quivered violently, sending a shock through the floorboards and making my lantern tremble. The shadows surged, twisting along the walls, coiling toward the coffin like living things. My stomach tightened as I realized the presence within was testing me further. I whispered the name again, 3 times, slower, softer, more deliberate. The movement beneath the sheet paused, then shifted in acknowledgement. The coffin had accepted my vigilance, but the lesson was far from complete. Hours passed as I remained near the coffin, observing, whispering names, measuring my movements with care. Every twitch of the hand beneath the sheet, every shift of the lid, every subtle quiver of the air carried meaning. I began to perceive patterns in the whispers, rhythms in the shadows, and a pulse that linked the coffin, the room, and the building itself. Hollow Suns was a living organism, sustained by the rules, the awareness of the dead, and the vigilance of those who served within. Mr. Hollow appeared silently at my side, his presence calm and commanding. "You see now," he said softly, "why the lid must never be closed. This is not about fear or convenience. It is about balance, about respect, about acknowledging what lies beyond the boundaries of life. The coffin waits, always, and it tests those who enter. You have passed thus far, but the lesson continues." I nodded, though I was exhausted, my body trembling from the intensity of awareness. I understood now that the coffin was not a trap. It was a sentinel. It was a measure of vigilance and respect. Every flicker of shadow, every whisper, every shift of air mattered. To close that lid, even slightly, would have been to break the delicate balance, to provoke a presence far older and more patient than myself. By the time I left room 3, the whispers had softened into a persistent hum, threading through the halls, threading through my mind. The coffin remained at the center, patient, watchful, infinitely aware. Hollow suns exhaled quietly around me, alive with memory and presence, and I knew that my nights here would never be the same. The fog outside pressed against the windows, the town silent and oblivious, unaware of the tension that pulsed within the funeral home. Every shadow, every creak, every subtle movement carried weight. I understood now that the coffin, room 3, and Hollow Suns itself were a nexus of memory, awareness, and vigilance. I had begun to understand the rules not as guidelines, but as lifelines. That night, sleep came only fitfully. threaded with whispers, shadows, and the subtle rhythm of presence that lingered at the edges of perception. I had faced the coffin, honored its awareness, and survived the test. But I knew the lessons were far from complete. The dead remembered, they observed, and they waited for those who would listen. The coffin, that must never be closed, remained patient, alert, and vigilant, a sentinel at the heart of room 3. And I knew that my role in Hollow Sun had deepened beyond observation. I was now a participant, a keeper of balance, a witness to awareness that had endured for generations. Every night forward would demand vigilance, patience, and understanding, for the presence within would not be still, and the whispers would never cease. The night arrived thick and suffocating, the fog curling through the streets, like fingers seeking to claim the living. Hollow Suns waited, silent and patient, its walls heavy with memory, its floors trembling with the awareness that had grown stronger over the past weeks. I carried my lantern through the hallways, every shadow deepened, every whisper pressing at the edges of perception, a constant reminder that the dead had not forgotten. Room 3 pulsed with subtle energy, the coffin at its center no longer dormant, no longer merely observing. Its presence stretched into the corners of the funeral home, threading through the walls, stirring the quiet air, awakening other presences that had slumbered in silence for decades. Each step I took toward it felt heavier than the last, weighted by awareness, by vigilance, by the fragile understanding that even the smallest misstep could provoke the restless. I reached the room, lantern trembling slightly in my hand. The air inside was colder than ever, thick with whispers that wound around my thoughts, threading into memory and instinct alike. Shadows pooled along the walls, curling closer to the coffin, pressing as though to protect or emphasize the presence within. I swallowed hard and whispered a name from the ledger 3 times, deliberately, carefully. The hand beneath the sheet flexed slowly, acknowledging me, asserting its consciousness, its awareness. Then the room shifted. Subtly at first, a vibration beneath the floorboards, a soft pressure in the air. Shadows began to writhe along the walls as though alive, curling and stretching toward the coffin. The whispers intensified, threading into my mind with almost a melodic insistence. It was not merely observation now, it was a call, a summons. Something had awakened, and the balance that had held the dead at bay was beginning to falter. I stepped back, lantern held high, heart hammering, and felt the air thicken around me. From the far corners of the funeral home, I heard faint scrapes and shifts, sounds that had never existed before. Drawers creaked open on their own. Coffins in other rooms shifted slightly, a low hum vibrating beneath their lids. The dead were stirring, responding to the presence within room 3, to the energy that I had felt pulsing and bending the very air. The whispers became a chorus, threading through my thoughts, insistent and commanding. Attention, awareness, respect, vigilance. Every syllable carried weight. I realized with a chill that the dead were testing me now, gauging my ability to maintain the rules under pressure, to honor the balance even as the boundaries between life and unlife strained. Suddenly the lid of the coffin quivered violently, and the shadows along the walls surged forward, pooling toward it. A hand lifted fully this time, curling upward, deliberate and insistent, as though demanding acknowledgement from the world beyond the sheet. The whispers pressed harder, threading into my mind like fine threads of ice. The presence within was awakening fully, no longer restrained by subtlety. I whispered the name again 3 times, louder, deliberate, mindful, and felt the room respond. The vibration beneath my feet intensified. Shadows twisted and stretched. And then I heard it. A faint shuffle from the back hallways, followed by another, then another. Coffins that had remained still for decades were shifting, lids moving slightly, subtle but deliberate. The dead were waking, and their awareness spread like ripples through water, touching every corner of hollow suns. My pulse raced, and I realized the gravity of the night. This was the culmination of weeks of vigilance, of patience, of respect. Room 3 had awakened not alone, but as a catalyst, stirring every presence that had been held in quiet dormancy. The whispers now roared in my mind, threading between fear and understanding. The dead were walking, not fully, not violently, but deliberately, with awareness, testing the rules, testing me, testing the fragile balance that kept chaos at bay. I stepped cautiously backward, lantern held high, aware of every shadow, every sound, every tremor beneath the floorboards. The hand beneath the sheet flexed again, and I understood that the presence within the coffin was not hostile. It was sentinel. It demanded respect, vigilance, and acknowledgement. And those who failed to honor it would be tested more forcefully, their ignorance of the rules paid for in ways I could not yet predict. The hallways of Hollow Suns seemed to pulse with movement. Faint footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed in rooms long forgotten. Coffins shifted, drawers creaked, whispers wound through the air like living threads. The dead were awake, aware and walking, yet restrained by the rules, by the awareness of their presence, and by the balance Room 3 enforced. I knew then that my nights had changed forever. No longer mere observation. No longer simple vigilance. I was now a participant in the balance, a witness to the awakening, a keeper of rules that maintained the fragile line between the living and the restless. Every step, every breath, every whispered name carried weight. The night the dead walked had begun, and Hollow Suns was alive with consciousness I could barely comprehend. The sound of movement grew sharper, closer, more deliberate. It was no longer confined to Room 3. Faint shuffles echoed from other corners of the funeral home, muffled yet unmistakable. The dead were testing their freedom, stretching the boundaries that had kept them restrained for decades. I gripped my lantern tighter, every step measured, every breath steady, aware that the rules were my only protection. I crept down the hall, lantern light casting long shadows that twisted along the walls like living tendrils. Coffins that had sat undisturbed for years now shifted slightly, their lids moving with careful, deliberate rhythm. I whispered names from the ledger, 3 repetitions each, slow and deliberate, mindful of the cadence the rules demanded. Each whisper was met with subtle acknowledgement, lids lifted, hands flexed, the faintest movements that reminded me these presences were awake and watching. A sudden creak from the far end of the hall made me freeze. A coffin lid slowly lifted on its own, revealing the form within. It did not sit upright, did not lunge. It simply stretched, fingers curling, flexing, as if testing the air. The whispers intensified, threading into my mind, pressing insistently. Yet with a rhythm I could learn to follow, I whispered the name again, careful to maintain balance in my tone and pace, and felt the presence settle slightly, but not entirely. The coffin in Room 3 reacted almost simultaneously, shifting with a force that sent a tremor through the floor. Shadows deepened, pooling along the edges of the room, stretching toward me as though testing my resolve. I stepped carefully, deliberately, mindful that any hasty action could provoke the awakened. The presence was patient, but it demanded recognition, awareness, and respect above all. From the other rooms, I heard more movement, subtle at first, then louder. Coffins shifted, lids flexed, and the faint sounds of shuffling filled the hallways. The whispers became a chorus winding through the building, a complex rhythm that intertwined with the floorboard's vibration, the wall's pressure, even the faint hum of the lantern in my hand. It was as though the funeral home itself had come alive, Each element harmonized to the awareness of the dead. I realized the rules were not just guidelines. They were lifelines. Each name whispered, each step taken, each subtle motion of acknowledgement kept the restless in check. Failure to follow them could provoke chaos, the collapse of balance I had worked so hard to maintain. I took another cautious step toward room 3, careful to respect the subtle spaces between shadow and presence. The hand beneath the sheet in room 3 flexed again, curling in acknowledgement, almost as if directing me. My pulse raced, but I maintained steady, deliberate breaths. Every movement had to be mindful. The dead were walking, but not in haste. They were testing, measuring, observing. My vigilance was their measure of safety, their understanding of respect. Then I heard it. A distinct scrape, sharper than the others coming from the far corridor. A coffin lid shifted violently, more pronounced than before. I froze, heart pounding, lantern shaking slightly in my grasp. The shadows stretched outward, pooling as if the building itself leaned toward the disturbance. The whispers surged, threading into my mind insistently. I understood then that the dead were not acting randomly. They were orchestrated by the awareness of room 3, guided by the sentinel presence at the center of the funeral home. I whispered the name from that distant coffin 3 times, deliberate and precise. The movement slowed and the vibrations softened, and the shadows receded slightly, though their presence lingered. I realized the dead were aware not just of my actions, but of intent. The room measured intent as much as motion, patience as much as vigilance. By then, the full weight of the night had settled over Hollow Suns. The whispers wound around me like threads of fog, threading through my thoughts and threading through the very walls. The dead were walking, yet restrained, held in balance by the rules, by acknowledgement, and by careful, deliberate awareness. Every step I took through the halls was heavy with responsibility. I understood fully now that this night would define me as a keeper of the balance, a participant in a fragile equilibrium that stretched between life and the restless. The dead moved not out of malice, but out of memory, awareness, and expectation. To honor their presence was to honor the house itself, and the rules were the bridge that allowed the living and the restless to coexist in this strange, haunted place. The movement of the dead became more pronounced as the night deepened. I could hear the subtle scraping of coffin lids, the shifting of bodies, the soft rustle of clothing long decayed. The whispers swelled into a chorus that threaded through the hallways, over the floors, and into my mind. Each step I took felt weighted with consequence, each breath a tether keeping the balance intact. The dead were awake, yet restrained by the rules I had begun to understand. Room 3 seemed to pulse with energy, the coffin at its center no longer simply observing. Its presence spread outward, threading into every corner, every shadow, every subtle vibration in the floorboards. The hand beneath the sheet lifted again, curling upward deliberately, insistent yet measured. I whispered the name I had learned long ago 3 times, careful to follow the cadence I had practiced over countless nights. The presence acknowledged me, flexing beneath the sheet. Yet the awareness seemed to ripple outward, touching other coffins, other presences, like a silent signal. From the far hall, a faint creak drew my attention. Another coffin shifted, the lid moving slightly, and the whispers surged again. The dead were testing me, measuring my vigilance, stretching the rules I had learned to their limits. Every movement, every whispered name, every flicker of observation mattered. I understood that failure, even for a moment, could disrupt the fragile balance and awaken forces I could not contain. I stepped carefully down the hall, lantern trembling slightly in my hand. Shadows twisted along the walls, curling and stretching in patterns that were almost deliberate, almost sentient. The whispers wrapped around me, threading into my mind in complex patterns of intent and awareness. I felt their presence pressing against me from all sides, testing, observing, challenging my understanding of the rules. Then I saw it. A coffin. In the corner shifted violently, the lid rising slightly as though something inside were stretching after decades of stillness. A hand lifted fully, curling with intent, flexing and reaching, demanding acknowledgement. The whispers surged again, threading through my mind in an almost melodic cadence, soft yet insistent. I whispered the name 3 times deliberately, and the movement paused, but the tension in the air remained thick and heavy with awareness. Room 3 reacted almost simultaneously. The coffin at its center quivered, the hand beneath the sheet flexing as though orchestrating the subtle movements throughout the building. I realized then that the dead were connected, not just by proximity, but by awareness. The rules were not merely guidelines, they were the threads holding the restless in equilibrium. Breaking them, even unintentionally, could unravel the delicate balance that allowed hollow suns to exist without chaos. I stepped closer to room 3, careful not to close the lid, careful not to break the pattern of acknowledgement and vigilance. The air was thick with tension, vibrating with the collective awareness of the awakened dead. Whispers intertwined with the soft hum of the floorboards, threading through the shadows, weaving a rhythm I could barely follow. Every movement had to be deliberate. Every step mattered. Every breath counted. A sudden shift from the far corridor made me freeze. Another coffin lid quivered violently, a faint groan threading through the air. Shadows stretched along the walls like living entities, curling closer to the center of the building. The whispers surged, a chorus of insistent voices threading into my mind, pressing against my thoughts, guiding me, testing me. The dead were walking. Not aimlessly, not violently, but deliberately, with awareness, measuring my intent, gauging my respect. I whispered the names of those in the distant coffins, careful to maintain the threefold cadence. The movement slowed slightly. The vibrations softened, but the presence remained fully aware, fully observant. I understood now that the dead were alive in a way I had not imagined, guided by memory, by awareness, and by the energy of room 3. By then my body ached, my hands trembled, but I continued to move deliberately, maintaining balance, whispering names, observing shadows, following the rhythm of awareness that threaded through every corner of the funeral home. Hollow Suns had transformed into a living organism, sustained by rules, observation, and respect. The dead walked, aware, conscious, yet restrained, held in check by the delicate balance I was learning to uphold. I reached room 3 once more, lantern held high. The coffin's hand lifted, curling and flexing with intent, as though acknowledging my endurance, my understanding. The whispers softened slightly, threading into my consciousness like a quiet exhale, a recognition that vigilance had been maintained. The night was far from over, but for a brief moment balance held. The air in the room vibrated with residual energy, the shadows curling softly around the edges, still patient, still watchful. I understood that hollow suns would never be silent again. The dead would continue to walk, to observe, to test, and I would remain their witness, their participant, their keeper of the rules. The night had begun. The dead had awakened, and the lesson of vigilance, respect, and awareness had been made clear. The night deepened into something unrecognizable, thick with whispers, shadows, and the subtle vibrations of awareness. Hollow suns had become a living organism, every coffin, every wall, every creak of the floorboard pulsing with a consciousness. The dead walked now, fully aware, moving with purpose, testing the boundaries and measuring my vigilance. Every breath I took felt heavy, laden with responsibility, tethered to the fragile balance that had kept chaos at bay for decades. I stood in the center of the hall, lantern held high, heart hammering. The whispers pressed against my mind like living threads, their rhythm insistent yet structured. Room 3 pulsed at the center of it all, the coffin's lid trembling, the hand beneath flexing and curling, orchestrating the subtle awakenings throughout the building. The dead were not chaotic. They were deliberate, aware, and patient. But patience could only stretch so far before testing became a confrontation. From the far hallway, a soft shuffle grew louder, more deliberate. Another coffin shifted violently, its lid moving enough to reveal a pale, worn hand. Shadows stretched along the walls, curling toward the awakening, pooling around the movement like a tide of darkness. I whispered the name of the occupant, careful, deliberate, maintaining the cadence the rules demanded. The hand flexed, then receded, acknowledgement given, yet tension remained thick in the air. A sudden shiver ran through the building, a low vibration that reverberated beneath my feet. Coffins shifted all at once, lids quivering, whispers surging into a chorus that threaded through every corner. The dead were aware of one another, connected through something older than time, older than the rules themselves. Their movements were measured, deliberate, yet more pronounced now, a reminder that balance was fragile, maintained only by vigilance and respect. I took cautious steps down the hall, mindful of every shadow, every subtle creak, every vibration in the floor. The dead followed the rhythm, testing me, measuring my awareness. The whispers threaded into my mind with increasing insistence, a chorus of awareness that carried both warning and guidance. I whispered each name carefully, 3 times, deliberately, feeling the recognition in the subtle movements of hands, lids, and shadows. The coffin in room 3 shifted violently. Its lid quivered, and the hand beneath flexed fully, almost reaching toward me, a silent command for acknowledgement. I knelt slightly, whispering the central name 3 times, my voice steady despite the weight pressing on my chest. The hand paused, then retreated, but the air itself seemed to pulse with satisfaction, as though my vigilance had been recognized. The far corridors erupted with movement. Coffins creaked open, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Hands flexed, fingers curled, lids lifted slightly, shadows writhed along the walls. The dead were walking fully now, yet restrained, moving in awareness, aware of my observation, and tethered to the rules that kept the balance intact. The whispers swelled, threading through the air, through the walls, through me. Every name spoken, every careful step, every acknowledgement of presence mattered now more than ever. I realized with a shiver that this night had been orchestrated by the coffin in room 3, the sentinel at the heart of Hollow Suns. Its awareness had awakened the others, testing the reach of my vigilance, the depth of my respect, and the patience of my understanding. Each movement was a message, each shadow a reminder. The dead remembered, the dead observed, and the dead waited for recognition. Hours passed in tense vigilance. I whispered names, observed movements, followed the rhythm of awareness that threaded through the building. The dead walked, aware, deliberate, yet restrained by respect and acknowledgement. I began to feel the rhythm of the house, a cadence in which shadows, whispers, movements, and presence were entwined. I understood that Hollow Suns was alive in a way that could never be ignored, that the dead walked not out of chaos, but in measured obedience to balance. Finally, the movement began to subside. Coffins shifted less violently, lids settled slightly, and the whispers softened, threading gently through the hallways. Room 3 pulsed softly, the hand beneath the sheet flexing one final time before retreating. The presence had acknowledged my vigilance, my understanding, my respect. I rose slowly, lantern held steady, heart still racing, yet a profound weight of relief settling across my shoulders. Hollow Suns exhaled quietly around me. The dead remained awake, aware, yet patient. The night had passed its test. I had survived the awakening, honored the rules, and maintained the delicate balance that tethered life to the restless. I understood finally that the rules were not merely guidelines, they were lifelines, bridges between worlds, threads that allowed the living and the dead to coexist within this strange, haunted place. As dawn's first light seeped faintly through the fogged windows, I took a measured step back. The whispers had softened into faint hums. The shadows had receded, but the awareness remained, patient, observant, infinitely vigilant. Hollow suns had taught me the weight of responsibility, the importance of respect, and the fragile balance that allowed the dead to walk without chaos. I left the funeral home slowly, every step deliberate, every breath measured. The town outside remained oblivious to the night's events, unaware of the restless presences that continued to observe, to remember, to test. I had become a participant, a witness, and a keeper of the rules. The dead walked, but they did not walk alone. I walked with them in vigilance, respect, and awareness. The night the dead walked had ended, but Hollow Suns remained alive, patient and watchful. I knew that I would return, that the whispers would continue, that the shadows would remain, and that the balance I had honored would need maintaining night after night. The dead remembered, the dead observed, and I had learned to listen.